Okay, so here's the second part of week two of social media communication. In the previous video, we looked at social networking sites as a way to bring users through social media platforms. And now I want to move this conversation on towards this concept of user-created content. So this is really looking at how users are coming to social media platforms and taking active approaches in producing content or interacting in some sense with other users. In the first instance, it's interesting to note the difference that Hinton and Horth give to UCC, user-created content, from UGC. So in their eyes, UGC was something which was created by users, which is then taken on by media organisations or others and used in different sort of broadcast types of ways. Whereas user-created content is user-created for other users to use on their sites. So I think it's an interesting way of how to talk about this shift that, as we spoke about last week, how Web 2.0 was a thing which has now evolved into social media. It's a process and time. Here we see user-generated content, UGC, also following in this transition from content being produced by users for other larger organisations into this more user by user for other users era, UCC. So I think the first thing to note there is that this is a challenging situation for not only media organisations, but for specific roles such as journalists, educators, business analysts, all sorts of like really specific, highly niche and expertise types of roles, expert type of roles, which are now being challenged by the masses of users who are specific experts in quite niche areas. Creating content around these types of spaces, which is an interesting area to explore, and I think one of the most significant areas to look at is the crisis communication area, where it's one thing to have a project which is asking people to send in photos. It's an entirely different thing to have someone who's in a flood zone, who's sharing information in a very specific and purposeful way for others to enable that flow of knowledge and information, with the hope, I guess, of avoiding natural disasters and that kind of thing. But what I think we are starting to see here is a relationship between participation, agency, and media, and this is certainly culturally specific. And a good way of looking at that is how social media networks are used within Australia in comparison to China, whereas lurking is seen to be an active form of participation in the Chinese context, whereas in Australia, lurking is seen to be very much as a passive type of social networking experience. So a way to think about this is a really useful term is Axel Bruns's prod usage theory. And so this builds from the concept that audiences are no longer passive, but are taking an active role in media content production, which of course is an arguable approach to assume that all audiences are passive. But it's a way to walk in, or a way to try and walk into this theory. And if we go back to Henry Jenkins, who started to think about fan communities and how users were reappropriating or poaching culture and reappropriating it. So, for example, Star Wars memes. People, die-hard fans in the Star Wars space, taking Star Wars content and creating entirely new pieces of work arguably good or bad. But nonetheless, users are investing a certain amount of labour and expertise and passion into what they're doing. So he looks at it from that perspective in terms of fan culture and how they're creating content around it. This I think intersects beautifully with Stuart Hall's encoding decoding theory, where Hall also says that audiences aren't a passive group. They're being quite active in how they're decoding the media and the messages which are coming to them. So I mean that's quite useful in the context of television, where he was thinking predominantly. But in terms of how that's being played out in online and social media spaces, we see a completely new approach to it. We're not only decoding pre-existing media, we're decoding it and then recoding it ourselves as we remix and recreate content for others. The next, I guess, historical way of thinking about UCC is when Charles Leadbeater emerges, and he starts to bring this concept of pro-am or professional amateur together, which was always quite problematic in that it put this crown of amateur on users who were not amateur content creators, but were probably hobbyists who may not might not have earned an income from the work that they were doing. It was more of a passion, which then I think provided a great opportunity for Axel Bruns to come in and talk about this space, but not in terms of this polar professional and amateur type of construct, but more as a blurring between producers and users of content. Prod usage has had a fair bit of momentum behind it, and I think it's a really useful way to think about this space. Interesting to note that I think the theory is starting to shift, maybe not away from prod usage, but the concept of the user is becoming more significant. And I think as we use the term user now, it has inherently built into it this production aspect. So it's not just the prod user, it's the user who is quite able and willing to contribute their agency into the media. I think another interesting thing to talk about here is Jean Berger's work on vernacular creativity, and something that she picks up on is that often creativity has been this thing of a professional who has a high artistic experience as a designer or a visual artist or a musician or whatever it might be, which ignores the concept that the ordinary folk can be quite creative in their normal day-to-day activities. And often when we're looking at content which is on YouTube or Twitter or whatever it might be, it's created by non-creative professionals. So as we're thinking our way through user-created content, I think it is quite refreshing to think about the vernacular creativity which is introduced into this space. And you can read more about that in her work, particularly around YouTube, some work that she did with Josh Green, the book that she wrote, her and Josh wrote. But if we use that as a starting point to think about why people contribute to these spaces, and we start to explore this concept of crowdsourcing. In the Hinton and Horth book, they use the Trove example, where there was a lot of material which was scanned and had to be corrected. And so something which is of that size, a project of that size, is incredibly expensive to provide labour for. So they crowdsourced users and enthusiasts to help them create this collection of artifacts. Probably the most famous example of this is Wikipedia, a group of Wikipedians who I guess facilitate the concept of anyone can edit the mantra of Wikipedia, which means that anyone can contribute anything into Wikipedia around their area of expertise. However, I'd argue that there's still this concept of a gatekeeper, the Wikipedian, who enables or disables that content to remain. In the most part, for the most part, they're doing a fact checking role, I guess. But there is still some issues around the gender makeup, the cultural makeup, and the age bias within Wikipedians. So you're still seeing this gatekeeper role very much exist within the space. So I'd like you to think about user-created content, and as we go through the remainder of this week's lecture, I put a film clip there at the start just to not because I'm a Mike Tompkins fan and not because I like the song Starships. And to be quite honest, I extremely dislike that song. But an interesting project and a shining example of how professionals are engaging and crowdsourcing users to come in and work with them increasingly. And I think it's a really nice example of that, regardless of whether you like pop music or not. But apart from that, I think it's a useful example that we can talk more about in the Google Hangouts. The tensions that are present within that space of professionals and users, how the two work with each other. Is it exploitative? Is it collaborative? There's a lot of things we can expand on in this one instance. And in the Hinton and Horth book, they go on to talk about concepts such as citizen journalism, activism, and I think that's where these sorts of UCC arguments play out in their own distinct and specific ways. I'll leave it there for this week to try and bring it in under the 40-minute mark for you. Just to mention that below, I really would like you to go into the ELO social revolution, as they're calling it, and set yourself up an account in that space. And this is where I really want you to notice and monitor how it is that you build your identity in this space. You can hear all about ELO as you do it. I won't preface it in any way. But please do note how you do that, and then I'd love you to leave a comment on our class blog, which talks about the process that you went through. See you in the Hangouts.